Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Josh Altig, Ballotpedia's Director of Research, filling in for our host, Victoria Rose. Thanks for being with us. Today, I'm very excited. We're joined by Zoltan Hajnal, who's a political science professor at UC San Diego and the director of the Yankelovich Center for Social Science Research. Zoltan's authored several award-winning books, and his research has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and elsewhere. His work focuses on racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, and voting behavior, particularly when it comes to election timing and off-cycle elections, which is what we're really looking forward to digging into today. Zoltan, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so whenever we have academics on the show, we love to learn more about what made them want to study our political system in the first place. So how did you decide to narrow in on this specific area of research, and tell us your background?
Sure, I'll try not to be too overly convoluted in this, what was a lengthy process. But really at the beginning, it was about trying to understand something that didn't seem to make sense. So as you travel around from city to city, from country to country, from place to place, there appear to be groups that are disadvantaged, excluded, left out. And sometimes those groups are obvious, and there are racial distinctions. Sometimes there are religious distinctions. And in other places, that they all look the same if you're just a visitor. So the underlying sort of drive was just trying to understand why some groups are excluded and what's going on and what role that plays. And then slowly that focused on the issue of race and ethnicity in the American context, in American democracy, and why are some groups less well represented, and trying to increasingly narrow in on oftentimes institutional and attitudinal factors that prevented Blacks, Latinos, other communities of color from having a full say in American democracy. That's probably long enough for now. I can tell lots of stories, but that may be more than the audience wants to hear already.
Yeah, and it's interesting that was sort of how you got into it. I stumbled across your work because at Ballotpedia, we need to know when elections are held. We spend a lot of time focusing on when the elections are happening and how to get information to people, and not least of which it's, when do you go to vote? So you've just done just tons of helpful research, a huge amount of research on when elections happen and election timing. And then, of course, that intersected with this idea of disparity when it comes to the effect of election timing on turnout. So that's our main focus today, but I think we'll probably spread out into all kinds of topics as we talk about that. To start, I know you and I have talked before about is kind of a pet peeve of mine, a lack of standard use of terms. So off-cycle and on-cycle elections are terms that are used frequently in this research and in media covering this idea of election timing. But they're not used consistently. So maybe I wonder if you could put into words for us the crux of the difference between an off-cycle election and an on-cycle election. And then we'll start talking about why that matters.
Sure. And I blame academics entirely on convoluted language, extraneous wording, and so on and so forth. But the real crux of the concern or focus on election timing is whether a local election for mayor, city council, school board, and the like is held on the same date, consolidated with a national election for president or a statewide contest. So whether local elections occur at the same time as federal and statewide elections, we can then, so that's quintessentially on cycle. And then we have a problem about how far off cycle or what the degree of off cycleness. But the core idea is it the same day as a federal contest or not?
Right. So it's kind of a relative term that references races at the top of the ballot. That makes sense to me. So now connect the dots for us. You talked about representation and racial disparity, and now we're talking about election timing. Why does election timing matter? Why does it matter when a race happens and when the election is held?
Sure, and it's also on the face of it incredibly boring in the sense of like this date of the election. Why do we care? And truth be told, I probably didn't care early on in my career, but what happens is that if you tie a local election for mayor and other offices to a presidential election in particular, what happens is there's already a ton of attention to that presidential election. And generally speaking, roughly half of us turn out to vote for that presidential contest. So if we just add a local election to the bottom of the ballot for that presidential contest, we already have half of the population participating. And in order to vote locally, that half of the population only needs to check off a ballot further down or check off a box further down the ballot. So it's really, really easy for the people who are already participating to just add in the local contests. And that's what makes a big difference. So think by contrast of a off-cycle election where the local election for city council is on some weird day in some weird month and oftentimes an odd year, people need to, specifically for the purpose of that local election, learn the date of that local election. They need to either get a mail-in ballot or figure out how to acquire a ballot. They need to then learn about the local election. They need to then oftentimes go to a location to participate in that particular local election. And that's a fair amount of work for what many Americans consider to be a relatively unimportant election. So that's something which I firmly disagree with, but many don't see the value in going through all those steps just for a local election. And so simply by matching these contests up with a higher salience presidential election, we're making it a lot easier for the people who are already participating in that higher salience election to also participate in their local election.
Right. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time looking specifically at school board elections and off-cycle school board elections, but you've done just so much research across sort of the spectrum at both the state and local level. Put into context for us how big this difference is. I've seen some off-cycle school board elections that are a third, a fifth of the turnout in the same location as for an on-cycle election. Put into context, like overall, what kind of effect are we talking about? What's the magnitude of this effect?
It is huge. So you're talking about doubling or tripling or quadrupling
right.
Or more turnout in these local level contests. And you're talking about going from oftentimes, say in a school board, turnout of 10% of the population to turnout that's closer to 40, 50% of the population. So it's massive gains in turnout. And just to put that a little bit in perspective for people who may be paying less attention to local politics, if we think about major reforms at the federal level, progressive, pro-democracy advocates are generally super excited if they can increase turnout by 1 percentage point. So early voting, repeal of strict voter ID laws, things that I've worked on and care very much about, we're talking about a change in turnout of 1, 2, 3 percentage points. For a local election timing reform, we're talking about, again, doubling and tripling and increasing turnout 20, 30 percentage points. So it's 10 times the size, different type of election, but 10 times the size, and therefore, obviously, more consequential for a local democracy than a lot of the things that we're working on at the federal level.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy. I know, like I have, you've spent so many hours combing through individual instances, looking at specific jurisdictions, specific races, and comparing turnout and looking at these factors. Are there any that stick out to you in all the thousands that you've looked at? Do you remember seeing like one or two and just wondering like what's going on here? So do you have any anecdotal instances that really stuck out to you in your thousands of data points of research?
Yeah, I'm not. It probably is thousands, although certainly not 1,000 anecdotes. One of the first places to change their election timing in recent years was the city of Los Angeles. And the reason that they decided to change turnout, and the citizens of Los Angeles voted for on-cycle elections, was turnout in the city had been horrifically low for a long period of time. Not an unusual phenomenon at all for off-cycle elections, but 20%, oftentimes maybe less, of the registered voter population was participating in important mayoral elections in the city. For the first time, the city of Los Angeles held an on-cycle November election this past year, 2022, and turnout had been hovering around 200,000-300,000 people in the city. In the first November even year mayoral election, they had 1 million voters. So you went from essentially 250,000 voters to 1 million voters. And probably not surprisingly, the city elected its first African-American female mayor, Karen Bass. And so you had a revolution in terms of who was involved in the election, and perhaps as a consequence, also some change in the type of candidate that was getting elected as well.
That's fascinating. That's sort of we've alluded to. There's so many different dynamics here. Often you'll see state level races coincide with federal races, but there are five states where governors, state legislators are all elected on odd years. So then you can have local elections line up with those statewide races. You can have local elections line up with primaries for federal elections. So there's all kinds of dynamics. And you pointed to the main reason I think that turnout is so different. I think it's intuitive on a big picture level why off-cycle elections have lower turnout. I know there are lots of people, even civically minded people, who never miss an election on quote unquote election day, but they've probably let a few local, city council, school board elections just slip by. I was wondering if you could maybe put into words a little bit more technically why it has such a large effect on voter turnout, and maybe get at the sort of the original point you made, is that this is not a proportional effect. It's not like turnout is being diminished across the board. There are specific demographics that have lower turnout at the off-cycle elections than other demographics. So why is it exactly that people don't come? Is it media attention, voter fatigues, unawareness, information availability? And then how does that translate to the more concerning or more specific effects on the proportional voter representation?
Sure. And I think in this answer, I'm probably going to be extrapolating a bit beyond the core knowledge that we have or the facts that we have. But as you were, and I don't know if this is really a technical reason, but as you were sort of alluding to, the reason why a lot of people don't participate in a lot of elections is that voting is costly, right? So right. It takes time and effort. It takes time to go to the polls. It takes mental effort to figure out who we're going to vote for. And, it takes time, and it takes foresight in being registered to vote ahead of time. So there's a series of steps that folks have to go through that are all, at least marginally, have some cost to them. And for most of us out there, we rightly believe that our vote may not determine the outcome of the election or contest. So the benefits of voting are abstract and minimal, and the costs are very real. So that's in general why it's hard to get people to participate. But in a local election, you have the added issue of people aren't all that well informed about what cities might be doing that affects their lives. And so they often think this is a less important election than, say, a gubernatorial or presidential election. So there's that. Plus, as you sort of suggested, we generally, as a media world, pay much less attention to local elections. So even if you're passively listening, you may not hear about what's going on at the local level and local democracy. And so you don't know the issues, and so you don't care as much. So there's all these excuses for not participating or participating less at the local arena, when, again, I would argue it's very important, and cities and school boards are in charge of our children's educations, and they're in charge of our streets, criminal justice, on all these sort of core elements of how we live are affected by our cities. So there's reason to be involved, but there's, again, lots of reason not to be involved. And then finally, simply by making it easier to vote in local elections, by coupling them with national elections, we kind of overcome many of the additional costs. All this is, and I'm going to be long-winded here on this answer, but all this is really consequential, not just in terms of getting more voters to the polls, which is important, and I firmly believe is important for democracy, but it's also really important because it not only changes how many people vote, it also changes who votes. So as you were sort of asking, we go from an off-cycle, low turnout world where the vote is dominated by a small subset of the population, often older folks, often more higher income folks, often whiter folks. And so a small unrepresentative set of folks, but by making the vote easier, it has a especially large impact on some of the more disadvantaged segments of the population. So when we move to even year on-cycle elections, we see that the share of younger voters increases by 20%. So it's more older voters participate, but the gains among youth voting are huge by comparison to the gains among older voters. And we see greater gains by racial and ethnic minorities, and we see greater gains by working class Americans. And all that leads us to a electorate that is not totally proportional or representative of the nation as a whole or the cities as a whole, but is much closer to. So we get more voters and we get more representative voters by moving to on-cycle elections.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think what I'm really curious about, and what I've had a hard time nailing down when looking at the research, is what other effects are predicted by that the timing of elections. So what I mean is, we know the direct effect is on voter turnout, and that's the key change, the key difference. Have you seen any or done any research that correlates that with election outcomes, either in the case of direct democracy with certain topics, or in the case of special interests, or even political party domination at certain levels? Like, is there an outcome effect that you can speak to that's data based?
Sure, there are actually lots of outcome effects. There's a range of them. I won't go through them in detail here and bore the audience too much on this, but there's some interesting things. One that you would expect. I'm working on a paper that looks at the effect of all this on the rate at which racial and ethnic minority candidates run and win. And it looks like we're seeing that in particular Latino candidates run more and are more successful, win a greater share of the vote, win office more often when elections are moved to on-cycle. So and that's just I think the beginning of looking at the types of candidates that win. There's also a range of research showing that the level of connection between voters and, say, city council members in particular is greater when you move to on-cycle dates. So in particular, if you look at the ideology of the median resident or voter in a city and the ideologies of city council members, the gap between those two is much smaller after you move to on-cycle elections. So it looks like we are representing the median voter of the city better when we move to on-cycle elections and expand the electorate. Another, I think, interesting and maybe unanticipated change is it looks like voters are paying more attention to what's going on in the local political or arena. So there's a really interesting study showing that in school board elections, when you move those to even year, voters become more responsive to the performance of school. So when student scores go up, incumbents stay in these on-cycle elections. And when student scores go down, the incumbents are more likely to get voted out. That's actually in contrast to the off-cycle election, where incumbents won or lost seemingly in an unrelated fashion to what was actually going on in the local school environment.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think that strikes me, that last study, and I want to get my hands on that, because one of the arguments, I think, originally when there was a strong movement for off-cycle elections, and one of the arguments even that I read now, is that the higher ballot items sort of dominate in terms of what topics are considered by voters and what issues are addressed and what candidates talk about, and that having these siloed off allows a more local focus. So it's fascinating to hear that you kind of see the opposite effect with that specific correlation of student scores. Can you speak to that though? Are there any candidate or campaign effects you see? Do on-cycle versus off-cycle elections have different nature of political discourse, or different candidate focuses, different topics that dominate? Is that an effect that's significant beyond in the research you've seen?
Yeah, and the short answer is we really don't know too much about that. I mean, I'll make a normative, or I'm not sure. I'll make an argument that if we get twice as many voters participating and we get a much more representative set of voters participating, that's almost inevitably going to bring more information, more knowledge, more different perspectives on the local political arena into the electoral process, and then almost inevitably going to result in a more efficient, more productive electoral outcome, and then policy making after that. But we don't, one of the concerns is that, by coupling with national elections, we are nationalizing local politics or making it more partisan. And I think that's at least a legitimate concern, and we don't have much data on that, and that hasn't been tested. The other, I think, perhaps reasonable concern is that local voters or people who vote in local elections will be less knowledgeable about those contests. And on that, we have a little bit more information, and the results to this point suggest that probably there's absolutely no difference in the information levels about local actors and local democracy before versus after you move to November even years. So that it's a concern that some have, but I think that aspect of the concern is probably ill-founded.
Yeah, if you count knowing when the election is as information about the election, then having them on cycle, it just automatically gives people so much more information. That's interesting. So you hinted at, with the Los Angeles example, something I really want to get into. One of the dynamics that I'm focused on in my research is trying to figure out when these elections are. And so there are certain states where the election timing is set at the state level, and everyone has their school board elections at the same time, or their city council elections at the same time, although that's less common. And then there's some states that give a lot more flexibility to kind of the local policymakers to decide when the elections take place. So I want to attack this next question sort of from two angles. Voters, what they prefer, but then also the sort of the leadership and the when city councils get to decide, and when charters are involved, how those cities and counties that have flexibility, how they make that decision. So first, from the voter perspective, I mean, I know I've all the local ballot measures I've seen suggesting a move to on-cycle have passed recently. I've only ever seen polls in favor, but can you speak a little bit more than I can about what do voters think of this? What do voters prefer when they're asked?
Sure. The public perspective on this is absolutely clear. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of Americans would prefer to vote in one election at one time rather than in multiple elections and on multiple dates in multiple different locations. So we are, as a electorate, making a clear and reasonable choice. And as you say, that's true in national polling. It's also true in the dozens or more than dozens of cases where cities have put the issue of election timing on the ballot. So I think the success rate is not, I know the success rate is not perfect, but it's probably around 99%. So Tucson, Arizona is, as far as I know, the only city that put this up and had voters reject on-cycle elections. And every other city that we've looked at, the voters generally overwhelmingly favored the move to on-cycle elections. I think also sort of important and unique in terms of public opinion on this issue is that it's largely nonpartisan in nature. So clear majorities of Democrats, clear majorities of independents, and clear majorities of Republicans all prefer to vote once rather than multiple times. So unlike almost every other electoral reform you could imagine in American politics today, this, at least so far, is largely nonpartisan and is supported on all sides by the public.
Right. Yeah. I want to get into that a lot. So one question I have is about dynamics at the local level. And then I want to talk about states, because everything you just talked about, it seems to me the obvious question, if I were listening to this, is, well, why do any off-cycle elections exist anymore? Right? It's hard to come up with advocates for off-cycle elections. It's hard to come up with good arguments sometimes. So I want to dig into that. But have you noticed any dynamics at the local level for cities, especially cities with charters, that predict when they do have flexibility, whether they have on-cycle or off-cycle elections? Like you just mentioned Tucson, and of course Tucson is one that's put it to a vote, but there are many, many cities that have never put it to a vote that still have off-cycle elections. Is there anything that's characteristic about those? Anything about that local political dynamic that makes them stick out?
That's a great question, and one I haven't really looked at in detail, but I would say, there are two major, maybe three major factors. One is inertia, right? So right. Whatever system you have in place, you just continue with that system. The other is that, as you say, there are many states that mandate off-cycle elections or mandate the date of local elections. And so cities just don't have a choice in those particular states. And then in the states where cities have some measure of control, I think there's a lack of knowledge. So this particular podcast might actually be really important in the sense of educating folks around the country who are interested in this topic. So it's just, this topic hasn't come to the fore all that much, and people really don't know that much about its large consequences in terms of voter turnout, in terms of the composition of the vote. So it's a lack of knowledge of the issue itself is really one of the main barriers. The other sort of common barrier is the incumbents themselves in a city. So if you are a city council member and you won an election when 10 or 20% of your registered voters turned out to vote, and in particular that was a very skewed 10 or 20%, you may rightly be concerned that you might not win re-election if the date of your election changes and you go from 10% turnout to 40% turnout, and you go from almost exclusively older voters to many younger voters participating. So you're worried about your own well-being, and as a result, you may be less supportive of this democracy engaging move than you might otherwise be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the things we talk about a lot and spend a lot of time sort of researching about Bellpedia is the incumbent advantage. We have an incumbency study every year, and just the quantity of incumbents that get reelected or aren't even contested is so high, and that's a measure for us that's really, really important. So how you're almost kind of hinting at a correlation between those two, that there might be an entrenched sort of incumbent desire to keep things the way they were because that's the system you were elected under. So like the status quo is working great for you. So then what I want to jump into next is the dynamic between these local elections and state legislation. And first I want to say much thanks to you and other academics like you, but a lot your work, I feel like this topic is getting more information in the last year or 2 years than it has before. I feel like there's been kind of this explosion of a relative explosion of discussion about this topic. Have you seen that as well? Do you think that's right, or am I just noticing it for the first time?
I'd love to call it an explosion. I do think there is a lot more attention to this topic, and I'll take a tiny bit of the credit, but lots of other folks are working on this, and I think it's really the obvious logic of the idea itself that is beginning to drive more and more attention. But certainly, so just in terms of the states and cities that are engaging in this issue. So in California sort of started out in 2015. They essentially mandated on-cycle elections for all cities in the state. Then Arizona passed a similar law mandating on-cycle elections. Then Virginia passed a law. And then there are currently bills moving forward in different ways in Montana and in Washington State. New York actually also passed a bill mandating that all county elections be moved to on-cycle, although I'm not sure the governor has yet signed that into law. So there's movement at the state level, broadly speaking, and looks like there could be more work on this in additional states, maybe some additional conversations in Minnesota. So that's all great. And then as we sort of talked about earlier, a lot of cities themselves have decided that they are going to move themselves to on-cycle elections, at least in the states that allow that. So we've seen Boulder, San Francisco voted to move recently, and so on and so forth. So that's great. And what's interesting in those cases when the city moves is it's usually not the city council members who are pushing it forward. It's citizens and ballot initiatives. So for potential activists out there, it's a hard road in the sense of you have to get all the signatures to put a measure on the ballot, but it's an easy win, 99% probability of winning if you can actually get it on your local ballot.
Right. Yeah. So you just named, 3 states that have made progress on this or moved the needle in a way. I'm curious about diving into a little more. Because like you said, it's a relative explosion. It's compared to the almost nothing. It looks like a lot, but there's still, a lot more attention that could be paid to this. And here at Ballotpedia, we've tracked dozens of bills introduced over the last 2 years to move certain local elections from off cycle to on cycle. And, some of them have passed, but a lot of them have not. A lot of them just die in committee or fail. So given the bipartisan support from legislators, the overwhelming support from voters, could we talk a little more about just throw some theories out there for why these bills that make it into committees and make it even onto the floor in some cases aren't passed in states that are controlled by both parties, really? Like how can you explain that given how much support there is?
Sure. And, the boring political science answer is that most bills or proposed bills don't become law. And so that this is a very normal pattern and one that we should expect. But I think it's also a bit a lack of knowledge and also a little bit of incumbent inertia in some senses, right? So whoever has benefited from the current system is worried about changing that system. So that includes city council members and association of city council members and so on and so forth, but it also includes election administrators. So you as an election administrator have a built up system that you're able to hold elections certainly yearly, but probably more than yearly. And what we're now asking you to do is drop half or more of the elections and then add this local election to the national or statewide contest. And that's radically changing your job, and that's raising concerns among that entire industry. And I think those are reasonable concerns. in response to some of those concerns is we have done surveys of election administrators that have gone through this already. So again, in California, lots of cities have shifted. If you survey the city clerks, they say, yeah, actually, it wasn't that bad. It worked out fine, no major issues. But for those who live in places that haven't experienced this very much, so you're going from the known to the unknown. And I think that's, at least at the beginning, somewhat scary and requires a fair amount of education, of which this program is great for that, but probably education directed at some of the key players that might help to block some of this legislation from moving forward, like the Association of Election Administrators or associations of local council members.
Yeah. Do you think there is local pressure kind of being exerted into the state legislative process on this? Or insofar, like you said, insofar as it's not just that these bills don't get passed because the legislators don't have enough time. Insofar as there is actually some resistance, would you say that it's more likely coming from incumbents in the affected jurisdictions or from that election administrative side? Or is it sort of split?
This is one that I will admit to not having a clear answer or the correct data to answer this fully. But for example, just to give you an anecdote, so the New York legislature recently passed this law mandating on-cycle county elections. And while the bill was on the governor's desk, there were many local administrators of counties who were yelling about all the horrible things that would happen as a result of this. Now, whether they actually have influence or not, and it could be that the governor's already signed the bill. I don't know. But that seems like at least one of the main factors that might be slowing things down.
Right. Yeah. I like that you mentioned direct democracy and initiatives, citizen initiative process. I spent my first 10 years at Ballotpedia working exclusively on ballot measures. And one of the things I kind of was very interesting to track was the marijuana legalization trend kind of sifting through the initiative process initially. And then it kind of transferred almost over into the legislative process. And it felt like sometimes it felt slow, but then it kind of felt like it snowballed a little bit. And all of a sudden you had a lot of activity. Do you see that as a possibility for a proposal like on-cycle elections, that you could roll it through some states that have the initiative process with citizen initiatives and then sort of gain mainstream information that way? Or is it just not hot button enough? Is it not interesting enough? I mean, marijuana is marijuana. It kind of spurs everyone's interest. This topic might not have that wow factor, but is that for people who are really passionate about this idea, is that a path forward at the state level?
It seems like a perfectly viable path forward from my perspective, and there are a few reasons for that. One is it's costly to get the signatures or the petitioner the petition. So there's definitely some effort in getting a measure on the ballot, but it's not something that couldn't be overcome if certain types of organizations with enough resources try to push the measure forward. And then secondly, and probably most importantly, yes, most people don't know what we're talking about when we say election timing, but it's pretty intuitive. It's just, do you want the local election on the same day as the national election or not once you hear about it?
Right.
And it's pretty clear that that's easier for voters, and it's pretty clear that the population is generally very much in favor of it. So if we could get it in on the ballot statewide, I would be very surprised if it generally didn't pass on the ballot.
Right. So you're talking about kind of putting forward $1 million or $2 million in some of the states, maybe the smaller ones, half that, to get it on the ballot. And then you don't have to worry about a $50 million campaign or a $10 million campaign because it's once it's there, once it's put in front of people's noses, it's more It's more.
So maybe Ballotpedia and UCSD can combine, and we can put forward a couple $1 million and get one of these going.
Well, yeah, Ballotpedia we don't advocate for any policy, even this one. But it's
and I'm guessing neither entity that I mentioned has $2 million to throw at the problem. So it's an unnecessary question to even address.
Yes. Well, I want to hear. I think you mentioned in passing a couple of pretty interesting projects. So what are you working on right now? What do you have to plug? What should I watch out there that's coming next?
Well, I mean, a lot of what I'm working on is actually on the policy reform side and trying to get some partners involved in more of a national campaign. So to actually get an explosion. So that's I'm not sure one should be expecting or looking for a greater attention to this topic, but hopefully there will be. And then on the research side, there's a number of different sort of policy areas that I think are interesting to look at. So does election timing impact housing policy? How does it impact the rate at which sort of tax and spend measures, ballot measures are put forward and when they pass and what's passed? So there's some interesting policy stuff in there as well. And then, as I mentioned, looking at voter knowledge, and there's some data that I'm working on to sort of get more closely at what is it that voters know about the local political arena, the local candidates, and how does that change as election timing changes? Right.
Well, that's fascinating. Our mission is to help voters get informed, right? So looking at that research and seeing a correlation between election timing and the information they actually have would be fascinating. And we definitely keep in touch and keep looking at the things you're churning out, because it's always fascinating, and you're kind of one of the go-tos in terms of research on this topic. Well, I really appreciate the time. Thanks for chatting. Is there anything else anything else important you need to tell us about this issue?
No, this was a great discussion. I really appreciate that you guys had me on here, and thank you for informing the public. This is really important.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for joining us again. And for our listeners, you can check out Zoltan's work and learn more about some of what we chatted about by checking out the links in our show notes. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Josh Altick, and thanks for listening.